Hello, and welcome to the new series of the Michael Collins House podcast. We have another great season planned ahead with some recordings of history talks from over the Michael Collins centenary commemoration period and some brand new recorded episodes also. This episode presents a recording of a talk given by Joseph Connell in Cork County Library in July of this year, ahead of the Michael Collins centenary commemoration. I would like to extend our thanks to the local studies section of the library who allowed us to record and present this podcast. In this talk, Joe gives a synopsis of Michael Collins' role in the Irish War of Independence and discusses the events leading up to Michael Collins' death at Béal Bláth also. He's a fantastic historian who has incredible knowledge of all things Michael Collins and gives a fantastic balanced talk. Connell, who has published a number of books on Michael Collins, including Michael Collins Dublin 1916-22, The Shadow War, The Terror War, and he has also published a number of books through the Kilmainham Tales series of books and booklets. The Who Shot Michael Collins book, a particularly well-balanced investigation of that ever-popular question. We were introduced to Joe O'Connell by Kilmainham Tales' Micheál Ó Divlín, who sadly passed away in recent months, and we'd like to extend our sympathies to his family and would like to dedicate this episode to his memory. So without further ado, here is Joseph Connell with Michael Collins, the War of Independence and more. Enjoy.
It's called the War of Independence. Sometimes it's called the Anglo-Irish War. It's called the Tan War. I call it the War of Independence. That's just a statement of a term. It's not a political. I'm not taking a side by using that. That's just a term that I used to talk about it. And Michael Collins wrote a great deal about it. I'll be quoting people throughout the lecture of Collins, other historians, and other Irish people. And what he said, it was a struggle between two governments. The one proposed by the Irish and the other one, the British one, that was constantly losing ground. The War of Independence was fought to give the Irish people a native government, deriving their authority from the Irish people. It was a guerrilla war for political goals. And don't forget, it's a political war. Military action, we'll talk about that today, is always what first comes to mind. But that military action, along with propaganda, catalyzed that political change. All such wars are different, and they're all the same. You'll hear me say that phrase many times today. All such wars are different, and they're all the same. Florence O'Donoghue from down here in Cork, who ran the intelligence and military here, very much like Collins did in Dublin, he wrote the type of guerrilla warfare that evolved and operated was a complete departure from any earlier armed efforts. It was original, unique, has no exact parallels either in the history of the Irish or in any similar struggle throughout the world before its time or in the numerous wars that have taken place since then. That statement can be viewed as true if it's only a little bit because all such wars are unique, but they're all different as well. The first wars were guerrilla wars. The first wars were tribal wars. The tribe on this side of the valley would attack the tribe on that side of the valley to take their weapons and to take their food. That's a guerrilla war. There were no conventional wars until there were city-states. They didn't do that. You didn't have the, when we think of ancient wars, we think of the Persians or the Greeks on this side of the plain. Those are very, very well developed. Guerrilla wars are the very first wars, and they're found everywhere. The Irish perfected their wars and perfected the strategy and tactics, and then they pass those on from others. In Ireland, when we talk about guerrilla wars, people immediately think of the precedent of the Boer Wars. The Boers used the people in the Spanish peninsula in the Napoleonic Wars. Every war builds upon the last one, and each one of the guerrillas uses what they did. They adapt it to their own circumstances, their own terrain, and they pass it along. One of the main aims of any guerrilla war is to provoke the opposing force into some kind of overreaction, and that will gain sympathy for the cause. In the Irish case, it was the international sympathy, not just in Europe, but particularly in the U.S. The people, by that sympathy of the international change, were driven into the arms of the IRA, which is exactly what Collins intended. Nothing could have brought the Irish and the separatists over to the nationalist position more than having forced them into it by the British reprisals. They were provoked very often intentionally. That is the nature of a guerrilla war. Many of you may know, you might have heard me on different things. I was in the Army when I was much younger, and I've spent most of my life as a lawyer. So I look at history a little bit differently. I don't look at it as an academic, and I'll do the same thing tonight. I'll present you evidence, for example, as a lawyer might present evidence to a court. But you will be the ladies and gentlemen of the jury. You will have to make up your minds about how history has developed. I will talk about the Irish War this afternoon, the wars that preceded it, and mostly the wars that followed it. And as I talk about each one, again, remember that phrase. All such wars are different, but they're all the same. So as with all such cases, let's start with what we know, and then we can kind of move there from continuing on from that. Right after he signed the treaty, Collins said, "I have signed my death warrant." Didn't he? He did say that. It was supposed to be in response to Lord Birkenhead, who said, "I have signed my political death warrant." But Birkenhead never said he said that. Birkenhead's daughter, Eleanor Furneaux Smith, who was a novelist, wrote the first words about that in her book, Life is a Circus, in 1939. That's the first time we see that in print. Rex Taylor wrote a book in 1958 called Michael Collins, and he's the first biographer who wrote that. And in his book, he quotes John O'Kane's letters very frequently, and he defines John O'Kane as a Galway businessman who was doing business in London at the time. But O'Kane never appears on any directory in Galway, in Ireland, or in London. Taylor said he got the letters from his niece, Edna O'Kane. Nobody's ever found her. Nobody's ever seen these letters. Nobody's ever seen anything printed like this, except in those books. And at the very end of his book, Taylor writes in his notes on the sources, the present writer gave a promise not to divulge the whereabouts of any of this material, but I'm prepared to depose on oath the material in this book in no way distorts the originals. Okay, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in this library, do you ever see that at the back end of any of these books? Did Collins say that? We have to examine things that we have been told. We have to examine accepted facts. We have to take a look at historical record and popular belief and try to determine if those beliefs are correct. But as well as learning to be politicians, Collins and the Irish did modernize urban guerrilla warfare. They wrote the blueprint for guerrilla warfare, particularly in the cities. The military action in conjunction with propaganda and politics, this led to their success. We see that forever. We see it in Melee, we see it in Israel, we see it in Cuba, we see it in Vietnam, we see it in Afghanistan. Exactly the same principles are applied. In 1917, Collins was thought of as being a physical force advocate. He followed Thomas Ashe as the head of the IRB. But over the years, 1917, up until the very day of his death, Collins was trying to make deals, and he finally understood that you cannot solve a political problem with military force. It's political that you have to do it that way. The function of the Irish military leaders, Collins and all the rest, and even the Irish flying columns, was not to defeat the British militarily. Tom Barry said, the object of a flying column should not be to fight, but to continue to exist, to harass the British, to keep them in the field so they can't take over the government. That is the function of a guerrilla. The principal task of the Irish was to distract the British government from their ability to govern. It was not to win a war. The guerrillas who have succeeded often don't win a war in that sense. I often use the word succeed because that's all you can do. They have forced the autocrat, the invader, the oppressor out because the autocrat or the invader has to look at the political goals of the Irish and the guerrillas in this case. Che Guevara, whose mother was a Lynch from Galway, wrote, "The guerrilla fighter is the Jesuit of warfare." All right, now before somebody starts to throw rocks, if you went to Gonzaga, that's okay. I have a history degree from the University of San Francisco. It's a nice little Jesuit university. It gave De Valera an honorary degree in 1919. So I kind of understand the Jesuits. And what Che said was, this means qualities of secretiveness, treachery, surprise that are the essential elements of guerrilla war. He wrote, it's a special kind of Jesuitism, naturally prompted by circumstances which necessitates acting at all times in ways that are different from the romantic and sporting conceptions with which we are taught to believe war is fought. The British always called the Irish contemptible. They thought they were cowardly. They hid behind fences. They hid behind rocks. To this day, every single army hates fighting a guerrilla war. It's always the same. When Castro and Guevara went to Cuba, their ship from Mexico was met on the beach by the forces of the Batista government. Almost all of their men were captured or killed, almost all their supplies were lost, and only 12 survived to go into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. They were successful in Cuba because they utilized worldwide propaganda to tell the world that they were better for the Cuban people than was the Batista regime. They could provide a better government. Most revolutionaries, doesn't make a difference when, commonly fail and they're executed. Some few of them succeed, go into the succeeding government. In Che's case, he became the Minister of Finance, just like Collins. Che was an abject failure at that, and Castro encouraged him, pushed him out. Che went to to Bolivia, and he went to the Congo to try and get any kind of revolutionary started there, and he failed. He had his great reputation. He was worldwide known. He had the picture that was drawn by the Irish artist. He was famous everywhere. Why did he fail? There was a 1964 secret report that was only released in 2002 by the Russian government that called Che nothing more than a roving incendiary. That's all he was. He was a military guerrilla. He was always looking for confrontation rather than compromise. Castro kept this in check in Cuba, but he didn't do so or couldn't do so when Che got away from there. Guevara was a military guerrilla. Castro was a political guerrilla. Military guerrillas lose. Political guerrillas can succeed. So why was the IRA affected then? What did they do differently in 1919 than Che did 100 or 50 years later? The IRA at that time were responding to the protests of the people against the British. In order for the Irish to succeed, they had to prove to the British and to the people that they could provide a better government. In the 1960s, there was a historian, Bernard Fall, and he wrote, "A government losing an insurgency is not being outfought, it is being out-administered." Still true to this very day. Within the framework of changing the government from a British one to an Irish one, they had to frustrate the British military, the Army, the RIC, the Black and Tans, all the rest of the British forces, but they had to assume government functions that would take over in the people's mind. The Doyle courts. This quasi-government was what brought the people over to the Irish side and let the people know that they could provide a better government than could the British. Now, when we talk about the War of Independence, especially down here, I suppose, but the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries are the first thing that comes to people's minds. Now, remember, these are separate entities, but they're often confused. And Tom Barry distinguished between them. He said the general feeling, even here in Ireland at the time, was that the Black and Tans were the worst. So I don't accept that at all. The Black and Tans included good and bad, like every armed force that you'll ever meet, and quite a number of them were actually quite decent men. But the auxiliaries were different. They were far worse than the Black and Tans. And I have no doubt that a few of them could pass as ordinary decent men, but the majority were the worst the British ever had anywhere in the field. There was a man down here in Cork, actually, who fought against both the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. His name was Patrick O'Shea. And he said they had neither religion nor morals. They had foul language. They called the Irish natives. They stole from each other. They sneered at the customs of the country. They drank to excess, and they put sugar on their porridge. And those of you who are smiling are the ones who put sugar on your porridge. Collins was deeply conscious of them, and he was deeply conscious of what the people were suffering. But he knew these inflammatory tactics were important. This is what bringing the people over to their side. So he later wrote, apart from the loss which these attacks on the British entail, good is done is it makes clear and clearer to the people what both sides stand for. So we must always emphasize that overshadowing the idea of the military aspect is the political record of the Irish. Politics is about principle, power, and persuasion, then and now. And persuasion is the most important factor. So not only do the most successful guerrillas stress the political over the military, but the victory that they supposedly provide is only important if it gives the people a new politics to believe in. The purely military effects of a war will soon be forgotten. And the British knew this too. Chief Secretary Duke in early 1918 wrote, the determination of Sinn Féin leaders is to make administration impossible. In later of 1918, Walter Long told the cabinet, it's a fight between the government and Sinn Féin as to who is going to govern the country. Before the War of Independence started, the British knew what it was going to be about. It was about politics. But the British never understood the Irish people, and they continued to make mistakes. Fear of conscription wasn't very far from the minds of people here in Ireland at the time. There was never anyone conscripted into World War I, but everyone was afraid of it. And in fact, in the spring of 1918, the British did try to apply conscription to the Irish, which caused great furor over here, and it drove the people over into the nationalist side again. Nothing could have been done at that time to popularize Sinn Féin more than that and to bring people over to that side. There was never anybody conscripted, but that's what was important. That really changed the view of the Irish. Winston Churchill never did very much for the Irish, certainly didn't very much in the First World War, but he was always good for a quotation. And he said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And the Irish didn't. They revolted and they came over, and that's what allowed the concept of the War of Independence to gain favor in the Irish community. Later then, in December of 1918, you had the election after the First World War. And to this very day, that 1918 election might very well have had the most profound impact of any election that's ever been held in Ireland. It asked, the Sinn Féin candidates asked really to be elected to a parliament that didn't exist. And that's an extraordinarily imaginative and constructive kind of an act, where you're proposing methods that don't actually exist. So you have to understand that in that 1918 election, it too changed the people. When P.S. O'Hagerty wrote late in 1924 about that election, he said it brought the people to the point that they gave their allegiance to Dáil Éireann, they obeyed it, they organized it, and they helped it. And after that, they didn't help the British government, and that was the change. If we jump ahead to the Truce and the Treaty, the historian Alison Phillips of TCD wrote, where all the science and all the mass powers of the Central Powers in World War I had failed in Ireland, the methods of Sinn Féin succeeded. They did so not because they reduced the army to defeat, but because the British government and the British people went to that mood of surrender, which is the essence of defeat. It's all political. So international opinion was influenced by the reports of British reprisals, and the reprisals were due to incompetent British policy, poor leadership, and the deliberate IRA provocations. It was not a military victory for either side. It was due to exhaustion. The War of Independence was certainly an aspect of political violence, but it was more than a manifestation of political violence. It really was a manifestation of violence as politics. That's exactly how it worked. So the IRA achieved a great deal then, but many volunteers didn't understand that. They didn't understand the limitations of military action. They didn't understand the concept of real politics, where in fact you use the facts and the circumstances to determine your position, not just ideology. That's what Collins did, and that's what made Collins so good at the time. Not necessarily military victories, but understanding the politics and the need that you were ultimately going to have to negotiate somewhere, somehow, and that was his great benefit. But many of those, as I say, the volunteers didn't understand that. And they thought when there was going to be negotiations with the British, it was going to be a victorious Irish delegation and a supplicant British delegation. Not at all true. The British didn't think they lost. And many of the British officers said, you give me 6 more weeks and I can win this war. The fact of the matter is, both sides had to go make compromises at the time. It is the essential truth of the situation. Despite what on either side thought, the truth was really that the IRA fought the British until the British government was ready to negotiate. The IRA had made Ireland ungovernable, civilly and militarily. Another 1980s historian, Michael Howard, wrote, in the 20th century, war was not, as it had been in the past, a conflict between armed forces alone, or even between treasuries. It's one between the willpower and the morale of the belligerent populations. There were effective limits on what was acceptable to the British public. As a result, the British politicians were limited and told the military to stabilize Ireland until they could begin some kind of negotiations. Think that changes? Not at all. Remember the words of Clemenceau. War is much too important to be left to the military. Then and now. One cannot solve a political problem with military force. Collins and the Irish ultimately recognized this and learned to keep an eye on propaganda and on politics. Collins' great achievement was maneuvering the British into a hopeless political dilemma. It was not in eliminating British forces. And the British finally realized this. Basil Thompson, who was the director of intelligence for the Home Office, wrote to Lord George in April of 1921, just before the truce, the country folk who were opposed to the operation of the IRA do not now mind. Although they were opposed to murders, they are in favor of ambushes. They are beginning to be proud of their Irish heroes, in spite of all the restrictions of martial law. Can you imagine the mindset change in the British government that the head of intelligence for the Home Office could write to the cabinet about Irish heroes? Not just murderers, but Irish heroes. Over time, the IRA had won the hearts and minds of all of the Irish people at that point. So we've talked about military goals, we've talked about politics, and the Irish War is one of propaganda. All guerrilla forces need a propaganda network. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, said the press is the greatest weapon in the armament of the modern commander. And John Paul Sartre wrote, words are loaded pistols, so aim carefully and make each one of them count. Guerrilla warfare is dependent upon legitimacy. If the British could ever make the Irish appear illegitimate, the war was going to take a different tack. From the outset, the Irish politicians, Collins, the strategists, had to put Ireland across as a small country fighting for its own little rights. And they did that. And propaganda turned the war against the British. The former Prime Minister, H.H. Asquith, wrote, in the Times, I say deliberately that never in the lifetime of the oldest among us has Britain sunk so low in the moral scale of nations. Things are being done in Ireland which would disgrace the blackest annals of the lowest despot in Europe. A former Prime Minister writing this in the Times. Historian Roy Foster said the real point was for the British when to start negotiations. And in the end, public and political opinion broke the British government's nerve while the IRA was still in the field. That was their victory. Domestic and international propaganda had changed, and the condemnation of the British was worldwide. Those Irish pistols, loaded with words, had achieved their aim, and in fact, they brought about the end of the war. And all of these activities were coordinated with intelligence. Collins, throughout the country, mostly, however, in Dublin, Florence O'Donoghue here in Cork. Intelligence is extraordinarily important. Intelligence drives operations. And the intelligence operations was used to blind the British, to wear them down and demoralize them. And they realized in order to neutralize the British, you had to kill some of the constables, both in London and here. Collins always said, I'm a builder, not a destroyer. I get rid of people only when they hinder my work. On both sides, they told people, don't get involved. Some did. Some resigned from the RIC, for example. Others did not. And those were the ones after whom Collins and the Irish went. But intelligence always depends, to this day, it always depends upon quick and dependable communications. And Collins and the Irish used that extensively. They used railway workers, they used sailors, they used doctors, they used hotel workers, and particularly they used women to carry dispatches and to carry weapons. They were extraordinarily important. If it weren't for the women during this period of time, they would have had a great lack of intelligence, and they used them very carefully. Just a couple examples. Molly O'Reilly was a young girl. She was only 15 years old and rising. She continued her activities after the rising itself. She went to work in clubs in Dublin, and she got involved in collecting information and sometimes weapons, and she turned the weapons over to Peter Clancy. Moira Llewellyn Davies was a very accomplished driver at the time. She had her own car, and she used to drive down here in Cork with a car full of weapons. Her co-driver was Leslie Price, who went on to marry Tom Berry. Josephine Marchmont Brown worked for the British in the Victoria Barracks here. After her husband was killed in the First World War, their son was held by his parents there in Wales, and they refused to give the son back to her. O'Donoghue led an IRA raiding party over to Wales, and they kidnapped the boy. They brought Reggie back to his mother, and Joseph became a very, very important spy for O'Donoghue. And then she married O'Donoghue. I think marriage was in the water down here in Cork or something. Bridget Lyons Thornton was going to medical school in Galway, and she used to drive back and forth from Galway to Longford with a bag full of weapons, and she'd often get the people on the train to help her with those weapons. And she said that when she ever was confronted on a train or at a roadblock, she had recourse to a prayer and a piece of feminine guile. Remember, all words are different and they're all the same. That's what Collins used, and that's what the Irish used for their intelligence. They clearly understood by this time the importance of politics, propaganda, and intelligence, even in a guerrilla war. Military action and propaganda drove the British into a political settlement. Politics and violence always go hand in hand. We can't look at the judgments of the War of Independence as being the judgments for every guerrilla war since, but every guerrilla war since has some of them there. And you have to look at terror, politics, propaganda, all these things. They're inherent in the war itself. All right, following the War of Independence, you all know that Collins was killed here in his home county. As he said, they won't kill me in my home county, which of course they did. And Pierce Beasley wrote the first biography of Collins in 1926. And there was very little written between that time and Frank O'Connor's book, The Big Fellow, in 1937, and then Taylor's book, which I previously mentioned, in 1958. In 1968, Owen Neeson wrote The Life and Times and the Death of Collins. And that book sparked some interest again in writing about that. But many, many books have been written about Collins at that time, and many books have touched upon at least a little bit the actions here in Béal and Bláth and how he was killed and what went on at that particular rising. We're going to take a look now just at some of those books very quickly to take a look at how this developed and how the view of what happened at Béal and Bláth actually has developed to what it is today. The first book, as I said, was Ian Neeson in 1968. He had very few known facts. He said the ambush was directed particularly against Collins at that time. There were very few men left of the ambush party. They were taking down the cart in the mine that was in the road. Most of the others had left, gone back to a pub. There was only one warning shot that was fired. It was getting dark at the time, and when there was a lull in the firing of the machine gun in Collins' escort, there was a single shot that was fired. That's about all he says. At the end, though, he says, it's generally assumed that Collins was shot by the enemy in front, but we don't know that. He could have been shot by somebody from behind. All we know, he was shot. So his book is very, very iffy. It's very nebulous. Then John Feehan wrote a book, The Shooting of Michael Collins, Murder or Accident in 1981. Now we start some of these different theories involved. That's a short book. It's only 138 pages, but you have to remember there are 0 sources or references. Not a one. He wrote that there was a junta, in his words, in the cabinet. He wrote, it is known that some of his cabinet who had finally settled on membership in the British Commonwealth and had abandoned the Republic were strongly opposed to Collins' moves and regarded him with suspicion. He then said this junta felt they were winning the Civil War and they should continue without negotiation until the IRA were brought to their knees and were surrendered unconditionally. So Collins had been trying for months to bring about reconciliation with former comrades, but we shouldn't do that. The junta had no such scruples. We should just fight. So then he says that we have two independent bodies with a direct interest in getting rid of Collins, the British Secret Service and the junta within the cabinet. But then he goes on to write, ironically, much has been said against the cabinet, but I never heard seriously suggested that they planned and ordered his death. I don't know how you connect those two dots. He did go on to say there were 5 possibilities as far as the ambush. Collins was killed by the IRA with a carefully aimed shot. That's unlikely. He was shot by the men who left the ambush and they're coming back. He said that's mostly unlikely. He could have accidentally shot himself. He said that's very unlikely. I'd agree. That's very unlikely. He was shot partially by one of his own men. He said that's a distinct possibility. So then he said he could have been shot by a stray bullet fired from the IRA in the general direction of the armored car as they were retreating. And that could easily have happened. So again, he's equivocating as he gets close to the book. But by the 1980s then, these conspiracy theories were coming along, and Michael Hopkinson wrote a book in 1989, Green Against Green, and he just simply said Collins' death can be attributed to his devil-may-care attitude, his decision to journey through hostile country, inadequate choices of convoy, and the tactics adopted. That's pretty careful. It's pretty nuanced, really. Meta Ryan, who was from this area, wrote a book called The Day Michael Collins Was Shot in 1989, and it's very well annotated. She was born in West Cork, although she moved away, and she relies very heavily on local lore. But she depends mostly on the account of a Jim Carney. There was no Jim Carney at the ambush. There was a Peter Carney, a Pete Carney, and she does quote him as well. But no one ever, in any other communication, any other statement, has ever found a Jim Carney. And she talks about Liam Dacey saying that when Collins went by, they knew he was going to come back the same way because he's going on his way to Cork, they'll come back the same direction. Dacey knew that the only unblocked road was the one on which they were traveling and that they were going to have to come back on the same way if they did. And after the convoy passed by, De Valera was in the area, and Dacey talked to them, and De Valera asked what would happen, and Dacey said it's most likely that they'll set up an ambush because that's just what the nature of the situation is here. Then there was a book in 1991 by Patrick Tuig, Father Tuig. Again, very well attributed. He has a unique writing style, any of those who've read him. In the middle of a paragraph about the ambush or something, he'll have indications about the parish priest and his cousin who was born over here, and that's her farm on the side. And then it'll zip right back into it. It's rather idiosyncratic and sometimes a little bit difficult to read, but he has a lot of stories of local lore. He does a very good job at that. But strangely enough, he describes Emmett Dalton as Collins' resentful understudy, and there's always been a strained relationship. No one else has ever said that. Emmett Dalton apparently idolized Collins. So again, there are claims here that are a little bit different. He does indicate that Collins was killed by one of the Republicans, although he lists several, and he doesn't exactly put his finger on any of them. Then we get to the 21st century here, and we start to get a little bit further away from what I would say are realistic kind of books. The first one was by S.M. Sigerson, and hers was book, The Assassination of Michael Collins, What Happened at Béal and Bláth. It's about 400 pages, well annotated, but it's important to note that half of those notes go back to Fian's book, which didn't have any notes. So she starts out by saying, quoting Fian, here we find then two independent bodies with a very direct interest in getting rid of Collins, the junta, and the cabinet, and the British Secret Service. So it's a little bit strange. But she also indicates, without any sources whatsoever, that the contention that Collins was inexperienced in combat is entirely contradicted by eyewitness testimony. On the contrary, the evidence is overwhelming that he planned, participated, commanded, and carried out and survived more actions that are known. Never, ever again is that in any other witness statement or any other book. It's unsourced, so we don't know where she found it. She says, though, that all the casualties and disasters of the Civil War rest squarely on De Valera's shoulders. In that sense, at least, Collins' death included. She says, when De Valera went to London in July 1921, he asked Lloyd George, how can I come over and negotiate a treaty if I know in advance there can't be a republic? Her view was that Lloyd George said someone else. So De Valera promised, in her words, to deliver Collins' head on a platter, and he did. Kind of unsourced, but I'm not sure where you get the source for that. All of this then would put De Valera in the enviable position of being able to structure everything to bring Collins to his death here in Cork. And it would exterminate everybody that would provide or propose an opposition really to De Valera going forward. So for all of this to work, it had to be very well planned, and is such a plan really feasible? And she asked that of herself in the book, and she answered the question, yes. She said, if De Valera and Lynch plotted, they were in a position to assure all of these factors. If they had the cooperation of Dalton, who could control the drivers of the touring car and the armored car, as well as the commander of the Crosley lorry, they could make sure that Collins would stop at exactly the right place, and the ambush could be carried out in this way. And then she asks, if this isn't the answer, what is? Isn't that the definition of a conspiracy theory? But as I said to you, as a lawyer, I'll present evidence to you as I would to a jury. Does it seem reasonable to you that after 100 years, 100 people on both sides would have gotten together and planned this ambush, and Collins was the only one killed, and that no one has talked? Now, I have a friend who's an investigator for the state's attorney's office back in the States. That'd be equivalent to your DPP here. And he has a saying, he's got a lot of sayings, but he has a saying, he said, only two people can keep a secret as long as one of them's dead. The idea that this would take place over 100 years and no one said anything and no one's written anything makes it very suspicious to me as evidence to present to you, ladies and gentlemen. Then you have Gerard Murphy, who in 2018 wrote the book, The Great Cover-Up, The Truth About the Death of Michael Collins. This is about 220 pages. It's very well annotated. And he starts out by saying, no one disagrees that Collins died because he had no combat experience, that he was suffering with hubris, he was careless about his own security, and he underestimated the determination of his enemies. He critiques Fian's book, saying Fian produced no evidence for his junta claim, nor any evidence of his British intelligence claim, and he just disparages Dalton. He said all Fian did was cast aspersions on Dalton's name without backing him up. But Murphy says it was Florence O'Donoghue the whole time. Florence O'Donoghue planned and instigated the entire ambush. He also says that the IRB held an inquest into Collins' death in 1966. Now, most historians will have a real difficulty finding any indication of the IRB after 1924. But he also indicates then that British intelligence supposed to receive a report on the 29th of July 1922 that Collins had been tried by the IRB in his inner circle of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, was found guilty of treason by the IRB, and was sentenced to death. They established 12 trusted men with orders to join the British Free State Army and to go kill Michael Collins in an ambush. But then the book continues mostly with this unique theory that in August of 1921, Florence O'Donoghue began suggesting to the IRB that Collins had neutral in the Civil War. But Murphy claims that O'Donoghue and O'Hagerty used their influence in the IRB to turn the IRA against the treaty, and even as the IRB Supreme Council was ratifying it, they were making plans to kill Collins. And then he indicates that in the summer of 1922, O'Donoghue's efforts finally bore fruit because he hustled him into coming down here to trap him in an ambush. He again said, this is all pointing in one direction, that O'Donoghue and O'Hagerty might have been at Béal and Bláth, that the anti-treaty elements in the IRA thought of Collins as a traitor and they wanted to kill him for implementing the treaty, and they led him into a trap. He writes in his book that the evidence is there that there was a plan put in place by the anti-treaty elements within the IRB to have Collins executed. More specifically, the Munster centers of the IRB, though how far this extended beyond O'Donoghue, he doesn't say. He says, where all this adds up to is the assassination of Collins was, in all likelihood, planned by a group of IRB men that received help from sleepers within the provisional government, and that O'Donoghue and O'Hagerty were the principals behind it all. All right. Those are the kind of books that we have about what happened there. There was actually an investigation by the government in 1924. They sent down one man, John Hickey. He was a guard at the time, and they sent him down to investigate this. Most of his report was classified, but it was printed in the Limerick Weekly Echo in 1972. He was asked to determine what happened, mostly because the government wanted to determine if Eamon de Valera, who was still in jail at the time, if he had anything to do with it. There were four main theories that were given to Hickey when he came down here. De Valera had him shot. He was shot by Jock McKeek, who was one of his men in his own convoy there in the armored car. He was shot by one of his other officers, particularly Emmett Dalton, or he was accidentally shot by the IRA. Hickey reported that the purpose of the investigation was to clarify who actually shot Collins and why. He reported there were these strong rumors, and he came down to dispel them. He said, over our 6-month investigation, he eliminated all these rumors and discounted the theories that they put forth. The government of the day took no action against the man who shot Michael Collins, but I feel myself that the main investigation was to discover the whereabouts of Eamon de Valera during the ambush. I believe that de Valera knew nothing of the ambush. And his investigation established without a doubt who did shoot Collins, but he did not put the name in, and the government never, ever promoted it. What do we really know about what happened to Béal and Bláth? What can I give to you as evidence, and then you can make your determination? We know when Collins left Dublin in August of 1922, he left on a Sunday. He was ill. He could have put this off, but this was actually the continuation of an investigation he had before Arthur Griffiths died. He was in Limerick when he was on an initial military investigation. Went back to Dublin for Griffiths' funeral, and then restarted this on the 20th of August 1922. He came down to Cork not just to do military investigation, but one of the things is he went to many of the banks down here where the anti-treaty forces had put in money, and he wanted to make sure that money came back to the state. Always the Minister for Finance. Follow the money. That was Collins, and he did a very good job of it. Then he wanted to meet people. Remember, at the end of his life, he was trying to make effort and make deals. He met with Emmett Dalton, and then he also met with Florence O'Donoghue and others in Cork, trying to make a deal, trying to find some way that they could bring this war to the end. By August of 1922, the anti-treaty forces were in a terrible military situation. They'd lost Cork, they'd been thrown out of Dublin. They were terrible militarily. Collins thought maybe we'd have the chance here to bring about some kind of reconciliation. He was desperately trying to bring the war to an end. He was trying to give some kind of face-saving arrangement to the anti-treaty forces. And he thought that he could ask O'Donoghue for his help as a neutral in doing this. The convoy then on that particular day went through Macroom, went to Béal and Bláth, then on to Bandon, then to Skibbereen, and back to Bandon. When they left Bandon on the last time, he told Dalton, if anyone fires on this, we'll stop and fight them. And Dalton didn't say anything right then. But when O'Donoghue met with the surviving members of the ambush party in 1964, they all said that they didn't know Collins was down here until that morning. He was not drawn into an ambush. He simply went by Long's pub there at the cross in Béal and Bláth. They saw him, said if he's going to come back today, he'll come back this road, and we'll send up an ambush for him. So the ambush party remained in place all day. At the end, they thought, well, maybe he's not coming back at all. They started to break up. In the late afternoon, some of them went back to the pub and to some of the other houses around. They began to disassemble the mine and the cart that were in the road. And when the first shots were fired, there were actually shots just telling other people that here's a convoy that we didn't expect. Dalton, at the first shot, said, drive like hell to the driver. And Collins said, stop, we'll fight them. There was a Vickers machine gun in the armored car. It jammed several times, and I use the word jam because that's the word that's always used. As a military person, that's a very bad term to use. There was nothing wrong with the mechanism of the machine gun. But that particular machine gun was belt fit. The cartridges were in a belt that went through the machine gun. If those cartridges weren't put in exactly correctly, the belt itself would jam up. So the machine gun didn't jam, but the belt did. Who cares? The machine gun stopped firing. Okay? That's probably an important thing to note about that. Collins, first of all, was Dalton behind the car. He ran behind the armored car. And then he said, look, I see them running away. Let's move down the road. Collins stood up, ran down the road, In the middle of the road, he started firing. That was the ambush party who was trying to retreat up over the brow of the hill. Dalton then said he heard the faint cry, "Emmett, I'm hit." I really doubt that. I know that's been publicized, but I would suggest to you that through experience, with the wound that was there, Collins said anything. In any case, Dalton and then the Commandant Sean O'Connell came over, said, "Where is he?" They found him lying face down in the road. The ambush was over in about 30 minutes. It was getting dark. It was misting. It would have been almost impossible to get off an aimed shot by that time anyway. These were individuals who were retreating and stop and fire, retreating and stop and fire. You might call it an accidental shot. It was just trying to cover their retreat, I believe. And it was only when Sean O'Galvin came back to the IRA later on that night and said that anybody had ever been shot. And those are the facts that are pretty much accepted by everybody in terms of where was the car or how did Collins get shot. I mentioned Eamon de Valera earlier, and let's move him into here. He was in Béal and Bláth at the time of that morning, but he had no involvement at all in the ambush. He had little political influence at all at the time, and he had no military influence at all at the time. And by this time, de Valera too was trying to bring the Civil War to an end. Liam Deasy had spoken to de Valera the night before, and de Valera's position was, "We've made our protest in arms. We have no hope to achieve military success. The honorable course would be for the IRA, for the Republicans to withdraw." Deasy countered that there were 1,000 men in the area and they were not going to surrender at that time. And remember, Liam Lynch had said to others and to Deasy as well, "Do not give de Valera any encouragement. We are not going to do that at this point." So the most reliable evidence indicates that de Valera was there. He went through Long's pub. He went to someone else. If you ask me the question about the movie Michael Collins, I'll give you my impressions on that, and they might be varied. I will simply say to you, all of you know that the end of the movie with de Valera and the cow buyer, no, absolutely not. The movie might have some problems in terms of historical accuracy, but that's a complete fantasy. De Valera was not in that position, and he wouldn't have been in that position, and no one would have listened to him anyway. So what evidence do I have that I can agree upon to give you? Well, there's some things that are known. It was not conducted, the ambush was not conducted by a flying column. It was a group of men who were there for a meeting anyway, who were surprised by Collins going by. It was directed against this one column that they knew Collins was in because they saw him there that morning. By the time of the ambush, most had given up. Most had gone home. Most had gone back to other villages or any place else. The mine and the dray cart were being pulled out of the side of the road. It was getting dark. It was misty. Everybody wanted to leave. And then all the firing stopped when Collins was hit. We know very, very little. And so we have several anomalies and questions that are left, not only about the ambush itself, but maybe about some things that happened afterward that have taken on a life of their own in many ways. Again, the anti-treaty forces in County Cork did not know that he was coming to the area, but many books now have said he was lured to that ambush. Why was there no official inquiry or inquest into Collins' death? Remember, the nature of an inquest is, by legal definition, that's to determine that someone died. We knew he died. There were other cases that didn't have inquests as well. Sure, there have been, perhaps, but an inquest is not to determine who shot him. It's just to determine that he was shot. So it's not surprising to me as a lawyer that one wasn't held. Why was there an autopsy report from Shankill? Why wasn't there an autopsy report by Shankill Hospital? When I came here this afternoon, Rory mentioned that his grandmother was there at Shankill Hospital, which is very important because she's a witness, because there are very many people who say he wasn't taken to that hospital. He was taken to another hospital in Cork. He was, in fact, taken there. So again, we have different opinions, but we're trying to narrow it down to what can we believe, what can we dismiss, and then what can we believe. It was a shot that was fired at him, an aim shot. This wasn't a shot that was fired as everybody else was retreating. What about the nature of the wound? Was it a ricochet? Was it a dum-dum? Was there material about Collins' death that was destroyed in 1932 as the new government was taking place? Who would have benefited by this? There's just a little bit of scientific evidence, but it's very, very important. John Harbison, who was the Irish state pathologist at the time, was asked in 1989 about this. And he indicated that it was a shot from a high-powered military rifle at the time, with a small wound, entry wound behind his left ear with a large wound behind his right ear, which is exactly the kind of wound one would expect of a high-powered rifle at the time. Those 2 wounds and exactly how they come out, that's exactly what we expect if we examine the science and the forensics and everything at the time. So this is a little bit of scientific evidence we have. But there's no shortage of fuel for those conspiracies I talked about. The only witnesses were Free State Army or they were ambushers. These were all participants and their accounts might not be objective. There were no 2 participants who were saying the same thing and they might be contradictory. That doesn't bother me. You're all probably parents. If you come home and there's the broken vase and every one of your kids has exactly the same story, you know they're lying. If they start pointing fingers at each other, then you figure out, well, now we might try and find out where this story is going. In after-action military reports, believe me, if everybody says exactly the same thing, they've gotten together a little bit before and they got their story straight. It doesn't bother me that there are different stories. It would bother me a lot if there weren't. So now we take a look and we say, maybe most importantly, to claim publicly for one person that I was the one who shot Collins, that might have marked this person as a pariah for the rest of his life. It might have gotten him killed. We don't know. So the fact that there's no certainty here of who did it or exactly what happened or exactly who fired the shot, it doesn't justify in my mind the claims which result from this sort of lack of knowledge. There are too many theories that are taking advantage of these unknowns. Remember, since Taylor's book in 1958, there have been dozens of books on Collins, and we go back to theories that are just multiplied. Anti-treaty forces lured him in. There was a junta in the cabinet. It was Emmett Dalton who was killed by him because he was working for British Secret Service just like he did in the Second World War. When De Valera went to London, De Valera said he was going to deliver his head on a plate. The anti-treaty elements in the IRB, this was on O'Donoghue. It was O'Donoghue and O'Hagerty who got together. And the British Secret Service infiltrated 14 people into the Free State Army, and they're the ones who did it. All of these are based on speculation. And like all good conspiracy theories, you can't prove them, but you can't disprove them either. Just because an answer is simple doesn't mean it's wrong. Occam's razor often applies in military actions just as it does in philosophy. Sometimes things are complicated enough without trying to overcomplicate them. And sometimes it's not necessary to know every single answer if we just try and eliminate all the bad ones. Piers Beasley wrote that book in 1926, and it's considered hagiography and it has a lot of mistakes. But he wrote, in fact, Michael Collins would appear to have been killed by a stray parting shot fired without very careful aim by one of the retreating ambushers. I would suggest to you that still might be the most accurate and really has the ring of unvarnished truth about it. Michael Collins was a man of imagination. He had a vision of the future. He was unbreakable will. He was a brilliant administrator. He said he was a soldier. He was not a politician. He proved he was not a soldier. He was probably a better politician than he gave him credit for. But he was a brilliant administrator. He was a pragmatist who was always trying to make a deal for Ireland until the very last day of his life. He was trying to make a compromise. He evolved a balance between physical force and political settlement. There are very many distinguished in the Irish War, and Michael Collins is one of them, but we have to understand nobody is one thing. We live in a binary time. Human beings like goods and bads. We like rights and wrongs. We like our side and their side. In every war, particularly guerrilla war, there is no such thing. Both sides commit outrageous acts, and the Irish War was no different. Collins and the others weren't saints, but he always said that his methods were the ones in order to fight the British Empire, which was the largest in the world at that time. It's one thing to know this, but it's another thing to have the ruthlessness to carry it out. Collins epitomized Lawrence's famous view. He said, all men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of the mind wake in the day to find it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous, for they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. And that was Collins. I started out today saying we have to separate the man from the myth, and we have to examine some of the things that we know are true and find out if maybe they are or they are not. It's appropriate maybe to end the same way. The man Michael Collins does not need any mythologizing. We do not need to elaborate at all on his story. He was not the man who won the war, but it's very difficult to understand where that war would have gone without the man Michael Collins. The story of Michael Collins is a very complex one. He was a very complex man himself, and he was a very controversial man. Just a couple of months ago, the Collins family here in Cork gave some diaries of Collins over to the state. The very last words that Collins wrote on the day before he died in his diary, pocket diary that he had carried the likes of since his days in London as a very young man. The very last words that Collins wrote were, "The people are splendid, and you are. And I've always been welcomed to Ireland with the greatest hospitality and kindness. And I thank you today for letting me come and talk to you here."
So there we have it, a fantastic talk from Joseph Connell. A very well balanced and informed discussion. Joe stuck around and answered questions for almost 30 minutes after the main talk. There were some great questions which were answered very well, but unfortunately we can't include this in the podcast episodes. Nonetheless, it was a fantastic talk, and again I would like to extend my thanks to the local studies of the Cork County Council County Library for making this possible. We hope you enjoyed the episode also, and will join us again on the next episode coming very soon in the near future. Thank you. Goodbye.